The ancient architects of reality, the old ones and the creation of the younger races. In the quietest hours, when the Astronomican's light wavers and ancient relics hum with forgotten power, there exists a truth that predates the Imperium by 60 million years. Before the Emperor walked among men, before the Aeldari danced between the stars, before even the first human ancestors descended from their trees, there existed beings of such profound wisdom and terrible power that their very existence shaped the destiny of all life in the galaxy. They were the first to cross the sea of stars, the first to bend reality to their will, and the first to understand that creation itself could be wielded as both art and weapon. They were the old ones, and their legacy bleeds through every corner of the galaxy even now, 10 million generations after their fall. The galaxy was young when consciousness first stirred within their cold-blooded minds. While stars still burned with the fury of youth, and nebulae swirled in patterns not yet catalogued by any observer. The old ones evolved from reptilian stock on a world whose name has been lost to the ages. They possessed what ancient texts describe as a slow, cold-blooded wisdom, studying the stars with patient deliberation, and raising astronomy and astrology to heights that would appear as arcane science to those who came after. Time moved differently for them. Where younger races would rush and stumble, the old ones contemplated, observed, and perfected their understanding across millennia that felt like moments in their perception of existence. Their physical forms reflected their patient nature. These reptilian beings possessed the methodical metabolism of cold-blooded creatures, allowing them to survive in conditions that would prove lethal to warm-blooded life. Their eyes, adapted to see across spectrums invisible to human sight, could perceive the subtle fluctuations of reality itself. Their hands, scaled and powerful, could manipulate matter at levels both gross and infinitesimal. Yet it was not their physical prowess that elevated them above all other species that would follow. It was their minds, vast and terrible in their capacity, that allowed them to achieve what none before or since have truly replicated. The old ones are believed to have been the first species in the galaxy to achieve sentience and self-awareness, arising in an era when the warp itself was calm, and the immaterium flowed with gentle currents rather than the violent tides that would later characterize it. They witnessed the galaxy in its relative innocence, when psychic energy moved through the Empyrean like water through crystal channels, uncorrupted by the suffering and rage that would later twist it into the nightmare realm known to the Imperium. In this pristine environment, the old ones developed their understanding of both the material universe and the realm beyond, achieving a synthesis of knowledge that has never been equaled. Slowly, methodically, they spread from their homeworld to nearby stars. At some unknown point in their development, they crafted the Webway to serve as a conduit through which they could travel to far-flung worlds without suffering from the tides of the warp. This singular achievement would prove to be perhaps their greatest contribution to the galaxy, a network of dimensional pathways that persists even in the darkness of the 41st millennium. Through these corridors between realities, the old ones achieved what every subsequent civilization would struggle to replicate: instantaneous travel across the vast gulfs of space without exposing themselves to the predations of the warp's denizens. As they explored the galaxy, the old ones encountered countless worlds teeming with primitive life. On barren rocks, they saw potential. In simple organisms, they perceived the seeds of consciousness. They believed that all life was useful, and are known to have brought about the rise of numerous new species and impregnated thousands of worlds which they made their own. This philosophy would guide their actions across millions of years, as they seeded, nurtured, and sometimes directly engineered life across the galaxy. They were gardeners on a galactic scale, and the entire Milky Way became their cultivation ground. Yet the Old Ones did not simply scatter life randomly across the stars. Every action served a purpose within frameworks of understanding that spanned geological epochs. They observed how life evolved, how consciousness emerged, and how psychic potential manifested in certain species. They learned to recognize the patterns that separated a species capable of achieving sapience from one that would remain forever locked in simple existence. And armed with this knowledge, they began to deliberately shape the future of the galaxy, creating servant races and warrior species, nurturing some primitive peoples while eliminating others whose existence conflicted with their inscrutable plans. The full extent of their works may never be known. Across millions of years, how many experiments did they conduct? How many species rose to consciousness at their guidance, only to fall back into extinction when they proved unsuited to their creator's purposes? How many worlds bear the hidden marks of their terraforming, their geological signatures buried beneath 60 million years of tectonic drift? The answers lie scattered across the galaxy in fragments too ancient for even the most learned of the mechanicists to fully comprehend. In genetic codes that carry echoes of deliberate design, and in structures that predate the oldest civilizations by unimaginable spans of time. What is certain is that the Old Ones represented something the galaxy has not seen since their fall. They were not conquerors seeking dominion through force. They were not destroyers seeking to unmake reality. They were architects working on scales of time and space that would drive lesser minds to madness. They looked at the galaxy and saw not what it was, but what it could become through careful cultivation across epochs. And for millions of years, their vision shaped reality itself. The Old Ones' mastery of reality extended far beyond simple genetic manipulation or even the construction of the Webway. Their understanding of the universe allowed them to manipulate alternate dimensions, and it was known that they undertook great works of psychic engineering. To comprehend the depth of their achievement, one must first understand that the Old Ones perceived reality not as a fixed constant, but as something fluid, malleable to those with sufficient knowledge and will. The barriers between dimensions that other races would later struggle to breach were, to the Old Ones, simply thresholds to be crossed with the proper understanding. Their psychic capabilities dwarfed those of even the most powerful psychers of the current age. While an Aeldari farseer might glimpse possible futures through great effort and risk, the Old Ones navigated probability streams with the ease of a child splashing in shallow water. While human astropaths struggle to send messages across the warp, often dying in the attempt, the Old Ones communicated across galactic distances with casual facility. The Immaterium during their reign remained relatively calm, its currents predictable, and its depths navigable without the constant threat of demonic predation that would characterize later eras. In this environment, the Old Ones perfected arts that would become forever lost after their fall. Consider the feat of creating the Webway itself. This was not merely a technological achievement, though the technology involved exceeds anything the Imperium has been able to produce even at the height of the Dark Age of technology. The Webway exists as a labyrinth between the materium and the warp, partitioned off from the immaterium through incredibly advanced Xenos engineering. It required an understanding of dimensional mechanics so profound that even the Aeldari, who inherited portions of the network and expanded upon it, never fully comprehended its original design. The Emperor himself, a being of immense psychic power and accumulated knowledge spanning tens of thousands of years, could only partially replicate their work, and even then required the Golden Throne as a psychic focus to maintain his inferior constructions. The Webway represented more than simply a faster method of travel. It embodied the Old One's philosophy made manifest in extra-dimensional architecture. At some unknown point, they crafted the Webway to serve as a conduit through which they could travel to far-flung worlds without suffering from the tides of the warp. By creating stable pathways through the shallow boundaries between the materium and immaterium, they achieved what every subsequent civilization would desperately seek: a means of traversing the galaxy without direct exposure to the warp's dangers. The technology required to construct such passages, to stabilize them across millions of years, and to protect them from intrusion by warp entities speaks to capabilities that modern races can scarcely imagine, let alone reproduce. The Webway would later be used as a way for the Old Ones to outmaneuver the Necron during the War in Heaven, leading to that race being turned into a minor irritant in the span of a few centuries. This strategic application of their greatest work demonstrates the Old Ones' approach to warfare. They did not simply create weapons of greater destructive power. Instead, they leveraged their superior understanding of reality itself to achieve tactical advantages their enemies could not counter. A Necron fleet might travel for years through real space to reach a target, only to find Old One's forces had arrived days earlier through the Webway, prepared defensive positions, and vanished back into the labyrinthine network before the enemy could engage. The construction of the Webway involved more than excavating tunnels through space-time. Elements of its construction include complex psychic wards to protect it from being breached, and hyperspatial pathways. Each segment required psychic engineering on scales that beggar comprehension. The wards that prevented demonic incursion had to be woven into the very fabric of the dimensional boundaries, creating barriers that would persist for millions of years without maintenance. The pathways themselves existed in states of carefully controlled superposition, simultaneously touching countless points in real space while remaining isolated from the warp's direct influence. Imagine standing at a Webway portal and truly understanding what you witnessed. You would see not merely an archway or doorway, but a wound in reality that had been carefully sutured to prevent infection by the immaterium's predators. You would perceive the layers of psychic architecture, each warding glyph serving functions within functions, creating redundancies upon redundancies. You would witness technology and psychic power merged so completely that attempting to separate them would be like trying to separate the wetness from water. This was the Old One's true genius, the ability to make the impossible merely difficult, and the difficult routine. But the Webway was not their only achievement in bending reality to their will. They undertook great works of psychic engineering, though the specific nature of many such projects remains unknown. Did they construct psychic amplifiers that could broadcast thoughts across the galaxy? Did they create zones where the laws of physics operated according to different constants? Did they engineer entire planets from raw materials, shaping continents and atmospheres according to precise specifications? The fragments of their legacy suggest all this and more, each discovery raising more questions about the full extent of their capabilities. Their manipulation of alternate dimensions extended to their genetic engineering as well. The species they created were not simply organisms adapted to physical environments. Many possessed innate connections to the warp, their very genetic structure incorporating psychic potential as a fundamental characteristic rather than a mutation or anomaly. This required understanding not just biological heredity, but how consciousness itself interacted with the immaterium, how genes could be structured to create minds that naturally interfaced with psychic energy. Modern geneticists struggle to modify existing species without catastrophic failure. The old ones designed species from foundational principles, their every cell optimized for purposes their creators deemed necessary. The patience required for such undertakings cannot be overstated. Creating a new species does not happen in years or even centuries. The old ones worked across timescales where millennia passed like seasons. They would seed a world with engineered organisms, then observe how those organisms evolved over hundreds of generations. They would make adjustments, introduce new traits, eliminate unsuitable variations. They would guide evolution through countless iterations, each cycle refining their creation toward its intended purpose. And because they possessed near immortality themselves, they could personally oversee projects that spanned epochs, never losing sight of goals that existed thousands of years in the future. This patient approach extended to their nurturing of sapient species as well. They believed that all life was useful, and they are known to have brought about the rise of numerous new species and impregnated thousands of worlds which they made their own. They did not simply create intelligent races and abandon them. Instead, they remained involved, teaching, guiding, and shaping cultures according to their unfathomable designs. The Aeldari legends speak of the Old Ones as distant but benevolent teachers, beings who appeared at crucial moments to impart knowledge or redirect development. How many other species received similar guidance? How many civilizations rose to greatness under the Old Ones' subtle direction, only to fall when their creators deemed them no longer necessary to the greater plan? Perhaps most remarkably, the Old Ones achieved all this while maintaining what appears to have been a fundamentally benevolent approach to life. Unlike the Necrontai, who sought conquest through military might, or the later Imperium, which would enforce compliance through overwhelming force, the Old Ones seemed genuinely interested in nurturing life for its own sake. They eliminated species when necessary, certainly, and they engineered warriors when war demanded them. But their primary impulse appeared to be creation rather than destruction, cultivation rather than exploitation. In a galaxy that has known primarily suffering and conflict for 60 million years, this stands as perhaps their most remarkable characteristic. Yet this benevolence would ultimately prove their undoing. By filling the galaxy with psychically active species, by connecting so many minds to the warp, by teaching their creations to draw upon the Immaterium's power, the Old Ones set in motion changes they could not have predicted. The warp that had been their ally, the calm ocean they navigated with confidence, would become their doom. But that transformation lay in the future, during a war that would reshape the galaxy and give birth to horrors beyond even the Old Ones' vast understanding. Before we can understand the Old Ones' fall, we must first comprehend the full scope of their creative works. The beings they engineered to serve specific purposes within their grand designs would outlast their creators by millions of years, each carrying forward fragments of the Old One's knowledge and philosophy. Some would evolve into the dominant powers of later ages. Others would fade into obscurity, their origins forgotten even by themselves. But all bore the marks of their creation, the genetic signatures of beings who understood life itself as a medium for artistic expression. The first and perhaps most favored of the Old One's created servants were the C'tan. In early editions of the lore, the C'tan or Old C'tan were actually identified as the Old Ones themselves, though later editions established them as a distinct created species. These amphibious beings served as the Old One's most trusted lieutenants, the only creatures capable of comprehending the full scope of their master's vision. The C'tan possessed considerable intellect and potent psychic abilities, allowing them to serve as intermediaries between the godlike Old Ones and the lesser races that would follow. The physical form of the C'tan reflected their creator's design philosophy. Like the Old Ones themselves, the C'tan were cold-blooded, adapted to survive in varied environments without the constant metabolic demands of warm-blooded creatures. Their amphibious nature allowed them to thrive in both aquatic and terrestrial environments, making them ideally suited to oversee worlds in various stages of terraforming. Their large heads housed brains of remarkable capacity, capable of processing information across multiple levels simultaneously. While they lacked the raw physical power of warrior species that would come later, the C'tan's intellectual and psychic capabilities more than compensated for any physical limitations. The Old C'tan taught the early Aeldari many secrets of the universe, including the principles of warp tunnel engineering, the nature of the warp, and referring to the sentient creatures of the warp as the powers of chaos. This educational role extended across countless species and millions of years. The C'tan served as teachers, architects, and administrators of the Old One's works. When the Old Ones decided a world required terraforming, C'tans oversaw the projects. When a primitive species showed promise but needed guidance, C'tan provided instruction. When the Webway required maintenance or expansion, C'tan engineers applied their understanding of dimensional mechanics to the task. The relationship between the Old Ones and their C'tan servants remains somewhat mysterious. The C'tan's relationship with the Old Ones was complex. They did not worship them as gods, but saw the Old Ones as their ultimate masters, flawless in their foresight and the source of perfection, albeit beings of flesh and blood, now departed. This suggests a dynamic more nuanced than simple master and servant. The C'tan understood they were created beings, yet they also recognized their creators as finite, subject to the same mortality as all living things, despite their immense power and knowledge. Perhaps this understanding created a sense of duty mixed with reverence, a commitment to continuing their creator's work even after the Old Ones themselves had passed from the galaxy. The C'tan's creation required the Old Ones to solve numerous biological challenges. How does one engineer a species capable of understanding concepts that span millions of years? How does one create minds that can process information at speeds necessary for psychic engineering while maintaining stable personality structures? How does one ensure that such powerful beings remain loyal to their creator's vision rather than pursuing their own agendas? The solutions the Old Ones devised speak to their mastery of genetic manipulation. The C'tan's brains operated on principles that modern science cannot fully comprehend. Their neural pathways incorporating psychic components that allowed them to directly interface with the warp while maintaining coherent thought. The empire of the C'tan eventually dwindled. The pace of their civilization slowed, and their genetic experiments largely abandoned. Rather than suffering from physical conflict, wars, or disasters, the reasons for abandoning their active role in galactic affairs appear to have been driven by a sudden and drastic change in their race's motivations. This mysterious withdrawal from galactic affairs occurred long after the Old One's fall, suggesting that the C'tan continued their creator's work for countless generations before finally succumbing to some inexplicable shift in purpose or understanding. Did they discover something that made material concerns irrelevant? Did they achieve some transcendent state that rendered physical existence meaningless? Or did they simply grow weary of trying to maintain an order their creators had envisioned but could no longer enforce? The C'tan's ultimate fate varied across different parts of the galaxy. Some populations persisted into the current age as the C'lani, degenerate descendants of the Old Ones, inhabiting an area north of the galactic pole, living upon a number of proximate and prosperous worlds as a closed but homogeneous society. These modern C'tan retain echoes of their ancient capabilities, but have lost the knowledge and purpose that once drove their kind. They maintain advanced technology they no longer fully understand, living according to mysterious life stage rituals that may be corrupted remnants of the Old One's instructions. In a sense, they represent the tragedy of inherited greatness, carrying the genetic legacy of their creators while having forgotten the meaning behind that legacy. Other C'tan populations exist within the Warhammer fantasy universe as the mage priests of the lizard men. Though whether these represent the same species separated by dimensional barriers or simply parallel evolutions remains a matter of speculation. The connections between the various iterations of the Old Ones and their C'tan servants across different continuities hints at deeper truths about the nature of the warp and the relationship between realities. But such metaphysical considerations lie beyond the scope of this examination. What remains certain is that the C'tan represented the Old One's first successful attempt at creating a servant race capable of understanding and implementing their vision. Every subsequent creation would build upon lessons learned through the C'tan's design. The psychic engineering techniques refined in their creation would be applied to later warrior races. The biological innovations that allowed the C'tan's amphibious nature would inform other aquatic or adaptable species. In a very real sense, the C'tan served as a prototype for everything that followed, the proof of concept that demonstrated the Old Ones could indeed design sapient life according to their specifications. Yet for all their capabilities, the C'tan were never warriors. They were administrators, architects, and scholars. When the Old Ones required combat forces, they would need to create very different kinds of beings. The peaceful order the Old Ones had established across millions of years would not last forever. Conflict approached from the galaxy's outer darkness, and with it would come the need for species designed not to create, but to destroy. The creation that perhaps best demonstrates the Old One's combination of practical genius and whimsical nature are the Jokaero. These orange-furred apes, bearing resemblance to orangutans of ancient Terra, were created during the closing days of the War in Heaven, when the Old Ones desperately needed new species to defend their last strongholds. Yet, unlike the other warrior races created during that desperate time, the Jokaero's primary attribute was not combat prowess, but technological aptitude of a sort that seems almost magical in its scope. The Jokaero are technically brilliant, with an innate, genetically structured understanding of technology. Their capabilities are seemingly instinctive, giving them a full understanding of machinery and technology that places them beyond even the most advanced of the known races. A Jokaero can examine a broken device it has never seen before and immediately understand not just how it functions, but how to repair it, improve it, and adapt it to new purposes. This ability is not learned or studied. It exists within their genetic code itself, as fundamental to their being as breathing or eating. The Old Ones had literally encoded technological genius into the Jokaero's DNA, creating a species that understood engineering on an intuitive level that would make the most learned magos of the Adeptus Mechanicus weep with envy. The physical form of the Jokaero seems almost comical at first glance. They appear as heavy-set, orange-furred simians with retractable fingers and toes, their bodies optimized for climbing and manipulation rather than combat. The physical resemblance of the Jokaero to orangutans of ancient Terra may not be coincidental, because it is established fact that the Slan have genetically manipulated the species as they are known to have visited the planet on numerous occasions. This connection raises intriguing questions about the Old Ones' relationship with Terra specifically. Did they see potential in Earth's primates that warranted repeated visits? Were the Jokaero created using Terran genetic stock as a foundation? Or is the resemblance merely convergent evolution toward a body plan the Old Ones found particularly useful? The Jokaero's capabilities extend far beyond simple mechanical aptitude. Their understanding of astrophysics is equally baffling. The Jokaero seem to be capable of tapping into unseen power currents that run through the galaxy. Their spacecraft exemplify this extraordinary understanding. These vessels are constructed as open-latticed polyhedron frames, resembling nothing so much as geometric sculptures floating through the void. Yet these seemingly fragile structures can traverse vast distances, maneuver with precision that defies conventional physics, and even transition through warp space by making physical alterations to their design. The ships channel galactic power currents in ways that suggest the Jokaero understand forces modern physics has yet to even detect, let alone harness. Creating a species with such innate technological understanding required the Old Ones to solve problems that boggle the mind. How does one encode knowledge into genetic sequences? The Jokaero do not learn technology through study or experimentation. They simply know, their understanding emerging fully formed from genetic programming that spans millions of base pairs. Every cell in a Jokaero's body carries the same technological knowledge, suggesting a level of genetic engineering that treats DNA as a data storage medium for information that normally requires conscious learning and practice. The techniques required to achieve this feat remain completely beyond modern understanding, representing perhaps the pinnacle of the Old Ones' bioengineering capabilities. The timing of the Jokaero's creation adds another layer to their story. During the closing days of the War in Heaven, after having already nurtured many species to assist them, the then desperate Old Ones brought forth newer creations, including the green-skinned Krork and the technology-mimicking Jokaero. This suggests the Jokaero were created not during the Old Ones' peaceful reign, but during their darkest hour, when their civilization teetered on the brink of collapse. Creating such sophisticated beings under such pressure speaks to the Old Ones' remarkable capabilities even in extremis. The Jokaero's purpose within the Old Ones' desperate defense strategy becomes clearer when examining their behavior. Jokaero have a natural aversion to close combat, preferring ranged combat, wherein they may remain at a safe distance. They were not designed as frontline warriors like the Krork. Instead, they served as support specialists, creating and maintaining the technological infrastructure necessary for sustained warfare. A Jokaero could repair damaged equipment in the field, modify weapons to counter new threats, and create defensive systems from whatever materials were available. They represented mobile fabrication capability, allowing Old One's forces to adapt to changing battlefield conditions without requiring lengthy supply chains. Yet the Jokaero's nature makes them nearly impossible to control or direct. They tend to live in large family groupings that consist of a dozen individuals, which roam the galaxy in a random fashion, with their sole objective being survival. They create only to fulfill their immediate needs, building complex devices and then abandoning them just as casually. Attempts to capture and compel Jokaero to work for other species typically fail disastrously, as the Jokaero simply build devices to facilitate their escape. This independent streak may have been deliberately engineered by the Old Ones, ensuring that even if their other creations turned against them, the Jokaero would never serve another master for long. The Jokaero's survival into the 41st millennium demonstrates the robustness of the Old Ones' final creations. Despite the destruction of their creators, the Jokaero continued to live on and into the age of the Imperium, where there was much speculation about their origins. They wander the galaxy in their impossible ships, occasionally interacting with other species when necessity demands, but primarily remaining aloof from the galaxy's conflicts. Some Inquisitors have managed to recruit individual Jokaero into their retinues, benefiting immensely from their abilities to enhance weapons and equipment, though such arrangements rarely last long before the Jokaero simply vanishes, called by imperatives only they understand. The existence of the Jokaero raises profound questions about the Old One's mindset during their final days. Why create a species of such remarkable capability if not to serve as a permanent solution to technological needs? Were the Jokaero intended to preserve and maintain the Old One's technology long after their creators had fallen? Or did the Old Ones recognize that the war was already lost and design the Jokaero as a gift to whatever species might inherit the galaxy, providing them with a source of technological innovation that could help rebuild civilization from the ashes of the war in heaven? Whatever their original purpose, the Jokaero endure. They build their impossible devices, sail their geometric ships through the void, and occasionally grace other species with their presence before vanishing back into the galactic wilderness. They are living testaments to the Old One's genius, proof that even in desperation, even facing extinction, the ancient architects could create beings of such sophistication that 60 million years later, the greatest scientific minds of the Imperium still cannot fully comprehend their nature or capabilities. The encounter that would ultimately doom both the Old Ones and reshape the galaxy occurred when their explorations brought them to the outer reaches of the galaxy, the region known as the Halo Stars. As the Old Ones passed through the cosmos, a number of younger and fiercer races developed within their wake, including the Necrons, who struggled in their colonization of other worlds. These humanoid beings had evolved under a star so malevolent that it bathed their homeworld in lethal radiation, cursing the Necrons with bodies prone to cancers and diseases, their lifespans measured in decades rather than the centuries or millennia enjoyed by more fortunate species. The Necrons had achieved interstellar travel through sheer determination and spite. Despite their short lives and perpetual suffering, they had forged an empire spanning multiple star systems, each dynasty controlling its own worlds while nominally owing allegiance to a ruling council called the Triarch. At this time, the Necrons Empire was suffering from the wars of secession, with the various dynasties battling one another. Internal divisions threatened to tear their civilization apart, as different royal houses jockeyed for power while their populations suffered and died under radiation that poisoned every breath they took. When the Necrontire encountered the Old Ones, they witnessed beings who possessed everything they desperately desired. The ultra-intelligent races of mystics known as the Old Ones were seen to have swiftly colonized other worlds with far greater ease and had an immense longevity to the point of immortality. While Necrontire warriors grew old and died between campaigns, Old One scholars pursued studies that spanned geological epochs. While Necrontire dynasties rose and fell within generations, the Old Ones maintained continuity of purpose across millions of years. The contrast was stark and, to the Necrontire, unbearably unjust. The Necrontire are known to have petitioned the Old Ones for the secret of eternal life, but they refused. The reasons for this refusal remain a matter of speculation. Perhaps the Old Ones recognized that the Necrontire's bitterness and rage would make them unsuitable recipients of immortality. Perhaps they saw in the Necrontire's warlike nature a threat to the peaceful order they had spent millions of years cultivating. Or perhaps the Old Ones simply did not possess the ability to grant immortality to another species, their own longevity being a product of their unique biology rather than a transferable technology. Whatever the reason, the refusal proved catastrophic. The Necrontire, already embittered by their cursed existence, took the Old Ones' rejection as the ultimate insult. Their silent king, Sarek, used this grievance to unite the fractious dynasties. Where internal conflicts had threatened to destroy the Necrontire Empire, hatred of the Old Ones provided a common cause that transcended dynastic rivalries. The wars of secession ended as the various houses turned their weapons outward, directing their rage against beings they perceived as hoarding the gift of life while allowing others to suffer and die. Thus began the First War in Heaven, a conflict that would span millions of years and ultimately consume both civilizations. The Necrontire declared war on the Old Ones at once, but the Old Ones, who had the means to travel across the galaxy through the Webway, proved nearly impossible to defeat. Necrontire fleets would arrive at Old One strongholds only to find them abandoned, the defenders having retreated through Webway portals the Necrontire could not follow. Old One's forces could strike at Necrontire worlds and vanish before reinforcements arrived. The strategic advantage provided by the Webway was insurmountable through conventional warfare. For centuries, the war dragged on, with the Necrontire suffering defeat after defeat. They possessed superior numbers and fierce determination, but these advantages meant nothing when they could not bring their enemies to battle. The Old Ones' mobility and their ability to choose when and where to engage rendered Necrontire numerical superiority irrelevant. Entire Necrontire fleets would spend years traversing the void only to find their targets vanished, while Old Ones' raiding parties materialized deep within Necrontire territory, struck critical installations, and disappeared before defenders could respond. The Necrons' frustration grew with each failed campaign. Their already short lives were consumed by futile military operations that achieved nothing beyond further depleting their numbers. The radiation sickness that plagued their race continued unabated, killing soldiers between deployments and preventing the accumulation of experienced veterans. Meanwhile, the Old Ones fought with beings who had witnessed the rise and fall of entire stellar civilizations, whose strategic thinking operated on timescales the Necrontire could barely comprehend. The mismatch was fundamental and seemed insurmountable. In their desperation, the Necron Tire turned to entities they had previously dismissed as mere stellar phenomena. The C'tan, or star gods, were vast energy beings that fed upon the radiation of stars. Incomprehensible entities of pure energy that had existed since the earliest moments of the universe. The C'tan possessed godlike power, but lacked physical form, making them unable to directly interact with the material universe beyond their feeding upon stellar energy. The Necrontyre's most brilliant minds conceived a terrible bargain. They would provide the C'tan with physical bodies in exchange for the power to defeat the Old Ones. The Necrontyre crafted bodies of living metal for the C'tan, vessels that could contain their vast energies while allowing them to interact with the physical universe. These bodies, forged from the necrodermis that would later compose Necron forms, gave the star gods abilities beyond anything they had possessed in their purely energetic state. No longer were they limited to passively feeding on stellar radiation. Now they could move, act, and most significantly, they could feed upon the life energy of organic beings, a sustenance far more satisfying than mere photons. The C'tan, particularly the one known as the Deceiver, then presented the Necrontyre with an offer that appeared to solve all their problems. Through a process called biotransference, the Necrontyre could abandon their weak, cancer-ridden flesh and have their consciousnesses transferred into bodies of living metal like those housing the C'tan themselves. They would achieve the immortality they had sought from the Old Ones, their minds preserved in indestructible forms that knew neither disease nor aging. The promise was irresistible to a race that had spent its entire existence struggling against the frailty of flesh. The Silent King, Sarek, agreed to the biotransference, though later accounts suggest he understood the true cost even as he condemned his people to their fate. In massive furnaces powered by the C'tan themselves, the entire Necrontyre race underwent the transformation. Billions of organic beings were rendered down, their bodies destroyed, and their minds transferred into mechanical shells. What emerged from those furnaces were the Necrons, immortal warriors in bodies of living metal, each one a pale shadow of the person they had once been. The biotransference was not the salvation the Necrontyre had hoped for. Instead, it represented the ultimate betrayal. The C'tan had fed upon the life force of the Necrontyre during the transfer, consuming the essential spark that made them truly alive. What remained in the metal shells were mere echoes of consciousness, most reduced to little more than automata, capable only of following basic programming. Even those who retained more of their awareness discovered that immortality without the ability to feel, to taste, to experience sensation was its own form of curse. The Necrontyre had traded the misery of their short lives for the eternal emptiness of undeath. But if the biotransference was a tragedy for the Necrontyre, it proved catastrophic for the Old Ones. The Necrons, as they were now called, possessed capabilities that made them the perfect weapons against the ancient architects. Their metal bodies could not be killed in any conventional sense, merely damaged and later repaired. They felt no pain, no fear, no mercy. Most significantly, they possessed no connection to the warp whatsoever. The psychic powers that had been among the Old Ones' greatest advantages were completely useless against enemies with no souls to affect, no minds to read, no emotions to manipulate. The C'tan themselves joined the war directly, their physical forms allowing them to manifest godlike power in battle. They could manipulate fundamental forces, reshape matter with a thought, and devour the life essence of entire populations. Different C'tan possessed different abilities. The Nightbringer embodied death itself, its very presence causing terror even in beings who had never known fear. The Deceiver specialized in manipulation and illusion. The Void Dragon commanded technology. The Burning One controlled fire and energy. Together, they represented threats the Old Ones had never faced before. The war resumed with renewed fury, but now the advantage had shifted dramatically. The Necrons could not use the Webway, but they no longer needed to chase their enemies through the labyrinthine network. They could simply destroy the Webway portals themselves, sealing off the Old Ones' primary means of escape. C'tan abilities allowed them to detect and target Webway entrances, collapsing portions of the ancient network and forcing the Old Ones to fight rather than flee. For the first time in millions of years, the Old Ones found themselves on the defensive. The scale of the conflict expanded beyond anything the galaxy had witnessed before. Entire star systems were consumed as battlefields. Planets were rendered down for resources or destroyed entirely when they served strategic purposes. The C'tan, in their hunger, would sometimes simply devour the stars around which Old Ones' worlds orbited, rendering those worlds lifeless and claiming victory through extinction rather than conquest. The Necrons waged war with tireless efficiency, never needing rest, never suffering morale failures, never questioning orders. They were the perfect army, and they were winning. Faced with this existential threat, the Old Ones were forced to adapt their strategy. If they could not defeat the Necrons through mobility and psychic power alone, they would need to create weapons specifically designed to combat their new enemies. The Necrons lacked souls, but they still occupied physical space. They could be destroyed through overwhelming force, even if they could not be killed in the traditional sense. And so, the Old Ones turned once again to their greatest skill, the creation of life itself. But this time, they would not create servants or administrators. This time, they would forge weapons in the shape of living beings, warrior races designed specifically to fight and destroy. The desperation of their situation drove the Old Ones to undertake genetic engineering projects on scales and timescales compressed far beyond their usual patient approach. Where previously they might have spent millennia perfecting a design, now they worked in centuries or even decades, accepting imperfections and unintended consequences in their haste to field combat-capable species. This rushed creation would have profound implications, not just for the war itself, but for the entire future of the galaxy. The weapons the Old Ones created would outlast their makers by millions of years, and some would evolve into the greatest powers of the 41st millennium. The Old Ones' first major warrior creation were the beings who would eventually become known as the Aeldari, though in their original form they may have been quite different from their modern descendants. The Aeldari were psychically potent, their very genetic structure optimized to interact with and channel energy from the warp. Where the Necrons represented the complete absence of psychic presence, the Aeldari embodied its opposite extreme. Every member of the species possessed at least some psychic capability, and their most gifted individuals could manipulate reality itself through force of will. The Old Ones designed the Aeldari not merely as psychic warriors, but as a race that could evolve and adapt over time. Unlike the static Necrons locked forever in their metal shells, the Aeldari were organic, capable of growth and change. Their biology incorporated accelerated evolution, allowing them to develop new capabilities in response to environmental pressures across mere generations rather than geological epochs. Their minds were sharp and quick, capable of processing information and adapting strategies in real time during combat. They possessed grace and agility that made them deadly in close quarters. Yet their psychic powers gave them devastating ranged capabilities as well. But perhaps most significantly, the Aeldari were designed with souls of unusual brightness and potency. In the warp, an Aeldari's psychic presence burned like a beacon compared to other species. This was both a strength and a vulnerability. The strength lay in their ability to draw upon warp energy for their powers. The vulnerability lay in how visible they were to entities within the Immaterium. Yet during the War in Heaven, the warp remained relatively calm, and this vulnerability did not yet pose the existential threat it would in later ages. The exact timeline of the Aeldari's creation remains uncertain, with some sources suggesting they were created during the closing days of the War in Heaven, while others imply an earlier origin. What is clear is that by the war's final phases, the Aeldari had become one of the Old One's most effective weapons against the Necrons. Aeldari warlocks could unleash psychic devastation that tore through Necron formations. Aeldari seers could predict enemy movements, allowing Old One's forces to ambush Necron armies or avoid overwhelming attacks. Aeldari warriors combined psychic enhancement with physical prowess, creating combatants who could face Necron soldiers in direct combat and prevail through superior skill and supernatural speed. The Old Ones taught the Aeldari much during this time. The Old Slan taught the early Aeldari many secrets of the universe, including the rudiments of psychic science, the construction of psychic amplifiers, and the dangers of the warp. They shared knowledge of the Webway, allowing the Aeldari to traverse the ancient network and eventually expand it for their own purposes. They instructed the Aeldari in the creation of Wraithbone, a psychoreactive material that could be shaped by psychic will and would later form the foundation of Aeldari technology. In essence, the Old Ones provided the Aeldari with the tools and knowledge necessary to potentially inherit the galaxy should their creators fall. Yet the Aeldari alone were not sufficient to turn the tide against the Necrons. They were powerful, yes, but they lacked the sheer physical resilience and raw destructive capability needed for sustained warfare against enemies that could be destroyed repeatedly but never truly killed. The Old Ones needed warriors who could match the Necrons in terms of durability and ferocity, beings who could hold ground rather than rely on mobility and tactics. And so they created the Krork, perhaps the most fearsome warrior race the galaxy has ever known. The Krork were genetically engineered as soldiers, their every biological system optimized for warfare. They stood far taller than humans, towering hulks of muscle and bone covered in thick green skin. Unlike the Aeldari's elegance and psychic finesse, the Krork embodied raw physical power. They possessed redundant organs that allowed them to survive injuries that would kill lesser beings. Their bones were incredibly dense, able to withstand tremendous impacts. Their muscles contained biochemical systems that could enhance strength during combat through the release of specialized enzymes. They were, in every sense, perfect soldiers designed to fight and fight and fight until nothing remained standing. But the Krork were far more sophisticated than simple brutes. They possessed notable intelligence and technological sophistication that would seem impossible given their brutal appearance. They understood complex engineering principles, allowing them to construct weapons and vehicles from scavenged materials. They possessed an instinctive understanding of warfare that went beyond simple aggression, capable of complex tactics and strategic thinking. Most remarkably, they possessed a form of collective psychic field that responded to their beliefs. If enough Krork believed something was true, their combined psychic energy would make it true within certain parameters. A poorly maintained weapon could function perfectly if the Krork wielding it believed it would work. Vehicles painted red would actually move faster because the Krork expected red things to be fast. The Krork's reproductive system represented another masterpiece of the Old One's genetic engineering. The Krork did not give birth in the traditional sense. Instead, they released spores when wounded or killed. These spores would take root in soil or organic matter and grow into new Krork, ensuring that every battlefield seeded future warriors. More significantly, the spores did not only grow into Krork themselves, they spawned an entire ecosystem of related organisms, including smaller greenskin subspecies that could serve as laborers and support personnel. This meant a single Krork population could rapidly expand to fill any ecological niche, creating self-sustaining warrior populations that required minimal oversight. During the War in Heaven, the Krork served as the Old One's shock troops and frontline warriors. Where the Aeldari struck with precision and withdrew, the Krork advanced relentlessly, overwhelming Necron positions through sheer ferocity and resilience. Necron warriors might destroy individual Krork, but the spores those deaths released would spawn more warriors in the weeks and months to follow. Entire worlds were seeded with Krork spores, transforming them into fortress worlds capable of fielding millions of green-skinned warriors. The Necrons found themselves fighting an enemy that grew stronger through conflict, that actually enjoyed warfare, and that could not be permanently eliminated as long as a single spore survived. The sophistication of the original Krork far exceeded that of their modern descendants, the Orcs. The Krork were organized, disciplined, and technologically advanced. They constructed weapons that rivaled or exceeded the quality of contemporary Necron and Aeldari technology. They built spacecraft capable of traversing the galaxy and coordinating multi-planet military campaigns. They possessed a command structure and strategic thinking that made them genuinely dangerous rather than merely numerous and violent. In many ways, the Krork represented what the Orcs could become if they ever regained the full potential their creators had engineered into them. Beyond the Aeldari and Krork, the Old Ones created other warrior races during the War in Heaven's desperate final days. Historical records mention the Knib and the Rashan, mysterious species about which almost nothing is known in the current age. Were they specialized warriors designed to counter specific Necron or C'tan capabilities? Were they failed experiments that proved unsuitable for the war's demands? Or did they serve purposes that remain completely obscure to modern understanding? The answers have been lost to time, buried beneath 60 million years of history. Some sources suggest the Old Ones may have also engineered or influenced the development of other species that would later achieve prominence. The Hrud, sometimes called the Nocturnal Warriors of Hrud, possess beliefs that suggest connection to beings they call Ka, who may represent the Old Ones in their racial memory. The Hrud's unique relationship with time and their ability to manipulate entropy fields could represent Old One's technology or genetic engineering, though definitive proof remains elusive. Other species scattered across the galaxy carry genetic markers that suggest deliberate design rather than natural evolution, hinting at Old One's involvement in their development. What united all these warrior races was their connection to the warp. Unlike the Necrons, who possessed no psychic presence at all, every species the Old Ones created possessed at least some interaction with the Immaterium. The Aeldari blazed with psychic power. The Krork generated collective psychic fields through their Gestalt consciousness. Even lesser species possessed enough warp connection to be affected by psychic attacks or to generate faint presences in the immaterium. This represented a calculated risk by the Old Ones. Psychic potential made their creations effective against the Necrons, but it also connected them to a realm that was beginning to change in dangerous ways. The war in heaven had been raging for millions of years by this point, and all that conflict, all that suffering and death had not gone unnoticed by the warp. The immaterium, which had been calm when the Old Ones first rose to consciousness, had begun to ripple and churn. The psychic echoes of quintillions dying, of rage and fear and desperation, were accumulating within the warp like sediment in a river. Something was changing in the realm beyond reality, and the Old Ones, focused on their desperate struggle for survival, either did not notice or could not spare attention to address it. The creation of so many psychically active species accelerated this process dramatically. Every Aeldari soul added its vibrant presence to the warp. Every Krork's death released psychic energy that resonated through the immaterium. The Old Ones themselves continued to wield immense psychic power in their engineering works and their attempts to maintain the Aegis protecting their strongholds. All of this psychic activity was feeding something in the warp, nurturing presences that had not existed in any meaningful sense when the war began. The Old Ones, in their desperation to create weapons against the Necrons, were inadvertently creating the instruments of their own destruction. Yet even as the galaxy burned, even as the Old Ones struggled against extinction, their creations proved effective. The Aeldari and Krork pushed back against Necron advances. Entire Necron tomb complexes were destroyed, their occupants scattered or imprisoned. C'tan were confronted by combined forces of Old Ones, Aeldari, and Krork, their godlike power challenged by psychic abilities they could not simply ignore. The war reached a stalemate, neither side capable of achieving final victory, but both too committed to consider peace. And in that stalemate lay the seeds of universal catastrophe. The true horror of the war in heaven was not merely the physical destruction it wrought across the galaxy. Entire civilizations that had nothing to do with the conflict between Old Ones and Necrons were exterminated as collateral damage. Countless worlds were rendered lifeless, their atmospheres burned away, or their surfaces melted to glass by weapons of unimaginable power. Stars were extinguished, their energy drained by the C'tan's hunger. The Webway, that great work that had taken the Old Ones millions of years to construct, suffered catastrophic damage as sections collapsed or were deliberately destroyed to prevent enemy use. But far worse than this physical devastation was the metaphysical wound the war was inflicting upon reality itself. The warp, that realm of pure psychic energy that existed parallel to material space, had begun to change in fundamental ways. The warp, that realm of pure psychic energy that had existed parallel to material space, had begun to change in fundamental ways. Where once it had been relatively calm, now it churned with currents of malevolence. Where once psychic entities had been simple and relatively benign, now something darker was taking shape within the immaterium's depths. The Old Ones' greatest work, their mastery of psychic engineering and their connection to the warp, was becoming their doom. The corruption of the warp during the war in heaven represents one of the most significant transformations in galactic history, yet its exact progression remains difficult to chart. What is clear is that the immaterium responds to and reflects the psychic emanations of sentient beings in real space. Emotions, thoughts, and experiences generate psychic energy that flows into the warp, shaping its substance and creating patterns that can eventually achieve something resembling consciousness. During the Old One's peaceful reign, when the galaxy contained relatively few sentient species, and those that existed lived primarily in harmony under Old One's guidance, the warp remained calm and navigable. The war in heaven changed everything. The conflict produced psychic emanations on scales the galaxy had never experienced before. Consider the emotions involved. The Necrontyrs' bitter rage at their cursed existence, their envy of the Old One's immortality, their hatred of those who refuse to help them. These negative emotions had been accumulating in the warp even before the war began. Then came the war itself, with its attendant fear, pain, and desperation. Billions died in the early phases of the conflict, each death releasing psychic energy into the warp. As the war escalated and the body count rose into the trillions and beyond, the immaterium was flooded with more negative psychic energy than it had absorbed in its entire previous existence. The Old One's creation of warrior races accelerated this corruption dramatically. By engineering species with strong psychic connections, the Old Ones had effectively created conduits that poured emotional energy into the warp at unprecedented rates. Every Aeldari warrior who felt fear before battle, every Krork who experienced the joy of combat, every Old One's guardian who died defending their strongholds, all of these experiences translated into warp energy. And because these were warrior races, the emotions they generated tended toward the extreme. Not mild contentment, but savage joy. Not simple concern, but abject terror. Not measured response, but overwhelming rage. The warp began to develop structure in response to this flood of emotion. Currents formed, following patterns established by the most common or intense emotional emanations. Eddies and whirlpools appeared where particularly traumatic events had occurred, places where the barrier between materium and immaterium had been stressed by intense psychic activity. And within these structures, something began to stir. Consciousness, or something approximating it, emerged from the chaos. These were not the simple psychic entities that had existed in the warp before the war. These were something new, something predatory, something that fed upon the very emotions that had given birth to them. The exact nature of these entities remains a matter of theological and philosophical debate within the Imperium. Were they demons in the traditional sense, evil spirits from some moral framework? Or were they simply psychic predators, creatures that evolved to exploit a new ecological niche the war had created? Did they possess true consciousness and malevolence? Or were they merely reflexive responses to psychic stimuli, no more morally culpable than a shark that attacks swimmers? Such questions might seem academic, but they touch upon fundamental issues about the nature of chaos itself. Regardless of the philosophical implications, the practical effect was clear. The warp had become dangerous in ways it had never been before. These warp entities, still primitive compared to what they would eventually become, began to manifest in real space with increasing frequency. Anywhere the barrier between dimensions grew thin, typically locations of intense psychic activity or extreme emotional trauma, these creatures could push through. They possessed capabilities that made them extraordinarily dangerous. They were not truly material beings, so conventional weapons often passed through them without effect. They fed upon psychic energy, making psykers particularly vulnerable to their attentions. They could manipulate emotions and perceptions, turning allies against each other, or causing paralyzing fear in even the bravest warriors. The Old Ones, masters of psychic engineering, should have been the best equipped to deal with this emerging threat. They understood the warp better than any other species ever had. They possessed the knowledge and power to construct barriers that could protect against psychic intrusion. They had maintained stable civilization for millions of years through careful management of their psychic capabilities. But the Old Ones were already stretched to their breaking points fighting the Necrons and C'tan. They lacked the resources to simultaneously combat the physical threat of the Necrons and the metaphysical threats emerging from the warp. More significantly, the Old Ones may have failed to recognize the full scope of the danger until it was too late. They were accustomed to the warp being a tool, something that could be controlled and directed through proper knowledge and technique. The concept that the immaterium itself could become hostile, that the very realm they had mastered could turn against them, may have been literally unthinkable to beings who had spent millions of years shaping reality according to their will. By the time they understood what was happening, the corruption had progressed beyond their ability to reverse. The warp entities grew stronger with each passing century of warfare. They fed upon the emotions generated by the conflict, and those emotions became more intense as the war ground on and desperation set in on all sides. The Old Ones' forces began reporting encounters with creatures that seemed to appear from nowhere, that could possess the bodies of psychically sensitive individuals, that could corrupt and twist reality in localized areas. By the time they understood what was happening, the corruption had progressed beyond their ability to reverse. The warp entities grew stronger with each passing century of warfare. They fed upon the emotions generated by the conflict, and those emotions became more intense as the war grounds on and desperation set in on all sides. The Old Ones' forces began reporting encounters with creatures that seemed to appear from nowhere, that could possess the bodies of psychically sensitive individuals, that could corrupt and twist reality in localized areas. These manifestations were still relatively rare and limited in scope, nothing compared to the full demonic invasions that would characterize later eras, but they represented a terrifying new factor in an already desperate situation. The Old Ones attempted to respond to this threat through the same means they had used for millions of years: psychic engineering and the creation of specialized species to address specific problems. There are suggestions in fragmented records that they created or empowered entities meant to serve as guardians against warp incursions, perhaps beings that existed partially in the immaterium and could combat the predators on their own ground. Whether such creations ever existed, and if so, what became of them, remains lost to history. What is clear is that any such efforts failed to stem the tide of corruption spreading through the warp. The situation was further complicated by the fact that the Old Ones could not simply stop using psychic power. The warp was fundamental to their technology, their communication, their very way of life. To abandon psychic abilities would mean surrendering most of their advantages and leaving themselves vulnerable to Necron attacks. They were trapped in a vicious cycle, forced to continue using the very capabilities that were feeding the corruption, unable to stop without dooming themselves to defeat by material enemies. Every psychic defense they erected against the Necrons added more energy to the warp. Every warrior race they created with psychic abilities poured more emotional content into the immaterium. They were caught between two existential threats, and neither offered any hope of victory. The Aeldari, as one of the Old One's most psychically potent creations, found themselves particularly affected by these warp changes. Their bright souls, which made them such effective psychic warriors, also made them highly visible to the predators emerging in the immaterium. Reports from this period, fragmentary and difficult to verify, suggest that Aeldari psychers began experiencing unprecedented difficulties. Visions became unreliable. Psychic communications were interrupted by strange interferences. Some psychers reported feeling watched, as if something in the warp had become aware of them and was paying attention. These were early warnings of changes that would culminate, millions of years later, in the birth of Slaanesh and the fall of the Aeldari. But their roots lay in the war in heaven. The Krork, less psychically potent than the Aeldari, but still connected to the warp through their gestalt field, also began to change. Their natural aggression, which the Old Ones had carefully calibrated to make them effective warriors while keeping them controllable, started to intensify. Krork forces became more difficult to direct, more prone to engaging in combat for its own sake rather than strategic objectives. Whether this represented direct warp influence or simply the inevitable result of creating a species that existed primarily for warfare remains unclear, but it signaled another way in which the Old Ones' creations were slipping beyond their control. The truly horrifying aspect of the warp's corruption was its permanence.
Physical damage could be repaired. Destroyed worlds could be terraformed anew. Even shattered Webway portals could theoretically be reconstructed, though with great difficulty. But the changes occurring in the warp appeared to be irreversible. Once the immaterium had been seeded with predatory entities and corrupted by negative emotional energy, there seemed to be no way to cleanse it. The Old Ones, who had shaped reality across millions of years, found themselves confronted by a problem that could not be solved through engineering or psychic power. They had broken something fundamental in the structure of reality, and they lacked the means to repair it. As the war in heaven entered what would prove to be its final phase, the Old Ones found themselves besieged on multiple fronts. The Necrons continued their relentless advance, their metal legions grinding forward with tireless efficiency. The C'tan wandered the battlefields like gods of destruction, their very presence warping reality and devouring life. And now, from the warp itself, new horrors emerged with increasing frequency, attacking Old Ones' strongholds and slaughtering defenders with appetites that could never be sated. The ancient architects, who had guided galactic civilization for millions of years, were being systematically destroyed by forces they had inadvertently created through their own actions. The Old Ones' strongholds began to fall with increasing rapidity. Each defeat fed more negative emotion into the warp, creating a cascade effect that accelerated the corruption. Survivors fleeing from Necron advances carried trauma and fear with them to new locations, spreading the psychic taint. Populations that had lived in relative peace for thousands of years suddenly found themselves thrust into desperate warfare, their terror and rage adding to the emotional storm building in the immaterium. The galaxy was becoming a charnel house, and the warp was transforming into a reflection of that horror. Then came the Enslavers, and with them the final doom of the Old One's civilization. The Enslavers were warp entities unlike anything that had appeared before. Where the earlier warp predators had been relatively small-scale threats, capable of possessing individuals or affecting limited areas, the Enslavers operated on an entirely different magnitude. They were parasites that fed upon psychic energy, but unlike simple predators, they possessed a terrible sophistication in how they exploited their prey.
They could dominate the minds of psychically sensitive individuals, turning them into puppets that served the enslavers' purposes. More horrifyingly, they could use possessed individuals as anchors to pull more enslavers through from the warp, creating cascading invasions that could consume entire worlds in a matter of days. The Enslaver Plague, as it came to be known, erupted across the galaxy with devastating speed. The exact mechanism by which the enslavers first manifested remains unclear. Perhaps they had always existed in the warp, but lacked the ability to push through into real space until the barrier between dimensions was weakened by the war in heaven.
Perhaps they were newly evolved entities, the latest iteration of warp predators that had developed specifically to exploit the psychically rich environment created by the psychically rich warrior races. Or perhaps they were something else entirely, entities from even deeper regions of the immaterium that the war had disturbed and drawn toward the material universe. Whatever their origin, the enslavers spread with horrifying rapidity. They appeared first in regions where the fighting had been most intense, where the barrier between materium and immaterium had been weakened by years of psychic warfare. A single enslaver could take control of a powerful psyker, using that individual's psychic capabilities to tear open larger breaches through which dozens more enslavers could emerge. Those enslavers would possess more victims, who would create more breaches, in an exponential expansion that overwhelmed any attempt at containment. Entire populations could be enslaved within weeks, transformed into shambling armies serving alien masters whose motivations remained completely incomprehensible to material minds. The enslavers posed an existential threat specifically to psychically active species. The Necrons, soulless and psychically inert, were completely immune to enslaver possession. The C'tan, beings of pure energy contained in necrodermis shells, could not be dominated by warp entities. But the Old Ones and all their created races, from the mighty Aeldari to the brutal Krork, were vulnerable. The very psychic connections that made them effective warriors became vectors for enslaver infection. The more powerful a psyker, the more attractive a target they became, as stronger minds could be used to anchor more powerful intrusions from the warp. The Old Ones attempted to respond to the enslaver threat, but they lacked the resources to mount an effective defense. Their civilization was already fragmenting under the combined pressure of Necron attacks and earlier warp incursions. Many of their greatest strongholds had fallen. Entire regions of space that had been under Old Ones' control for millions of years had been abandoned or lost. The Webway, their greatest strategic asset, had suffered such extensive damage that many sections were no longer safe to traverse. They were exhausted, depleted, and facing an enemy that specifically countered their greatest strength. Some Old One strongholds managed to erect powerful psychic barriers that prevented enslaver incursions, at least temporarily. These defenses required constant maintenance by the most powerful psykers the Old Ones could marshal, draining resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. Other strongholds attempted to reduce their psychic profile, limiting their use of warp-based abilities in hopes of avoiding enslaver attention. This strategy proved equally futile, as it left them vulnerable to Necron attacks that they could no longer effectively counter without psychic powers. There was no good solution, only a choice between different forms of doom. The Aeldari, deeply connected to the warp through their very genetics, suffered catastrophically from the Enslaver Plague. Entire Aeldari populations fell to possession. Their powerful psychic abilities turned against them as enslavers used them to create massive breaches through which yet more entities could pour. The Aeldari's bright souls, which had made them such effective weapons against the Necrons, now marked them as prime targets for possession. Some Aeldari attempted to suppress their psychic abilities, but this was like asking them to stop breathing. Their connection to the warp was fundamental to their existence, woven into every aspect of their biology and culture by the Old One's design. The Krork fared somewhat better due to their more limited psychic capabilities. Individual Krork possessed much less psychic power than individual Aeldari, making them less attractive targets for possession. However, the Krork's Gestalt psychic field meant that large concentrations of Krork still created psychic signatures visible to enslavers. Krork populations in some regions fragmented, breaking into smaller groups that generated weaker psychic presences. This survival strategy worked to some degree, but it also meant the Krork could no longer operate as the coordinated military force the Old Ones had intended. They reverted to smaller tribal organizations, losing much of the sophistication and discipline their creators had engineered into them. The scale of death during the Enslaver Plague is difficult to comprehend. Entire species that had achieved spacefaring civilization were reduced to extinction or scattered remnants within decades. Worlds that had supported billions were rendered lifeless, their populations either killed by enslavers or enslaved to serve incomprehensible purposes before being discarded. The warp itself became even more corrupted as the mass death and suffering fed the very entities responsible for the slaughter. It was a spiral of destruction from which there seemed to be no escape, a perfect storm of physical warfare and metaphysical horror that threatened to render the galaxy permanently uninhabitable to sentient life. For the Old Ones specifically, the Enslaver Plague represented the final catastrophe that broke their civilization entirely. They were already weakened by millions of years of warfare against the Necrons and C'tan. They had spent countless resources creating and maintaining warrior races to fight in their defense. They had watched as their greatest achievements, from the Webway to their carefully nurtured civilizations, were systematically destroyed. And now, the very realm they had mastered, the psychic dimension that had been the source of their power and the foundation of their technology, had become their executioner. The ultimate fate of the Old Ones themselves remains one of the greatest mysteries in galactic history. Did they die, killed by Necrons, C'tan, enslavers, or some combination of all three? Were they scattered to the far reaches of the galaxy, small populations fleeing to remote star systems where they might escape notice? Did some achieve a form of transcendence, abandoning physical form entirely to exist in some other state beyond material comprehension? Or did a remnant survive, hiding in Webway sanctuaries or distant worlds, waiting for conditions to improve so they could emerge and rebuild? None of these questions have definitive answers. What is known is that the Old Ones as a civilization ceased to exist. Their empire, which had spanned the galaxy and endured for millions of years, collapsed within a span of time measured in centuries rather than millennia. Their vast knowledge, accumulated across epochs, was largely lost as repositories were destroyed and those who carried the knowledge died or vanished. Their grand works fell into ruin or were claimed by successor species who could not comprehend their original purposes. The first war in heaven ended not with any side achieving victory, but with mutual destruction that nearly rendered the galaxy uninhabitable. The Necrons, despite their apparent victory over the Old Ones, had paid their own terrible price. The biotransference had robbed them of everything that made life worth living.
They had gained immortality, but lost their souls in the process. Many Necrons, particularly the lower-ranked warriors, had been reduced to little more than automata, capable only of following pre-programmed responses. Even those who retained more of their consciousness, the Necron lords and overlords, found their new existence hollow and meaningless. They had won the war, but lost any reason to celebrate victory. Moreover, the Necrons faced the same Enslaver threat as everyone else. While they could not be possessed due to their lack of souls, they could still be physically attacked by enslaved populations, and the general collapse of galactic civilization affected them as much as anyone. The C'tan, ever hungry and now unopposed, began to view their Necron servants not as allies but as resources to be exploited. Some C'tan actually began to turn on the Necrons, seeking to feed upon them as they had fed upon so many others. The Necrons found themselves in danger even in victory. The solution the Necrons devised represented perhaps the most audacious act in galactic history. Led by the Silent King, Krork, the Necrons rose up against their C'tan masters. Using weapons specifically designed to harm energy beings, the Necrons shattered the seemingly immortal forms, fragmenting them into countless shards that could be imprisoned and controlled. This rebellion was catastrophically costly, destroying countless Necron warriors and requiring technological innovations that pushed Necron science to its limits. But it succeeded, freeing the Necrons from their gods, even as it demonstrated the depths of their transformation from the Necron tire they had once been. With the C'tan defeated and the galaxy plunged into chaos by the Enslaver Plague, the Silent King made a final decision. The Necrons would enter hibernation, sealing themselves into stasis tombs on worlds scattered throughout the galaxy, waiting for the Enslaver threat to pass and the galaxy to stabilize. They would sleep for millions of years, their consciousness suspended, their civilization preserved in amber against a time when the galaxy might once again be suitable for habitation. It was surrender disguised as strategy, an acknowledgement that they had won the war but could not survive the aftermath. One by one, the tomb worlds sealed themselves, and the Necrons vanished from the galaxy, leaving behind only ruins and legends. The Enslaver Plague eventually burned itself out, though exactly how or why remains unclear. Perhaps the entities exhausted the available psychic energy and retreated back into the warp. Perhaps changes in the barrier between dimensions made it more difficult for them to manifest. Perhaps some force unknown to history intervened to drive them back. Whatever the cause, the infestations gradually decreased, and over thousands of years, the Enslaver threat faded from immediate crisis to lingering danger to distant memory. But the galaxy they left behind was fundamentally transformed. Entire regions of space had been rendered lifeless, their worlds scoured clean of organic material. The warp remained corrupted, its depths now home to predators and worse things that would never disappear. The Webway, once the greatest achievement of the old ones, was shattered and broken. Large sections collapsed or deliberately sealed to prevent them from becoming vectors for demonic incursion. The infrastructure of galactic civilization, built up over millions of years, lay in ruins. Life would recover, eventually, as it always does. New species would rise to fill the ecological niches left empty by the war's devastation. But the galaxy would never again know the ordered, peaceful age that had existed under the Old Ones' patient guidance. The legacy of the Old Ones extended far beyond their own survival or extinction.
The species they had created outlasted their makers, evolving and changing across millions of years into the races that would dominate the 41st millennium. The Aeldari survived the war in heaven and its aftermath, though greatly reduced in numbers and forced to adapt to a much more hostile galaxy. They retained much of the knowledge the Old Ones had taught them, including access to portions of the Webway and the ability to craft Wraithbone. They expanded the Webway themselves, adding their own sections to the ancient network, though they never matched the Old Ones' original construction in scope or sophistication. The Aeldari would go on to build a vast empire that spanned the galaxy, an age of peace and prosperity that lasted millions of years. They achieved heights of art, science, and culture that approached the Old Ones' own accomplishments. But they carried within them the seeds of their own destruction, placed there by their creators during the desperate days of the war in heaven. Their powerful souls and strong psychic connections, designed to make them effective warriors, also made them vulnerable to the corrupted warp. Over millions of years, as their civilization grew decadent and their focus shifted from survival to pleasure, their collective psychic emanations would feed something terrible gestating in the warp. The birth of Slaanesh and the fall of the Aeldari can be traced directly back to the genetic engineering choices the Old Ones made when creating them as weapons against the Necrons. The Krork survived as well, though they devolved significantly from their original form. Without the Old Ones to maintain their sophisticated social structures and technological knowledge, the Krork gradually simplified, losing much of their intelligence and organization. They became the Orcs, still formidable warriors, but lacking the discipline and sophistication of their ancestors. The Orc-Wog phenomenon, where orcs gather in massive hordes, driven by Gestalt psychic compulsion to wage war, represents a corrupted echo of the original Krork military organization. The orcs' ability to create functional technology from literal garbage through their collective psychic field demonstrates a remnant of Krork capabilities, though applied in much more primitive ways. Yet, even as degraded orcs, they remain testimony to the Old Ones' genius. They are nearly impossible to eliminate entirely due to their spore-based reproduction. They thrive in the most hostile environments. They genuinely enjoy combat, making them self-motivated warriors who require no complex logistics or supply chains. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, the orcs represent one of the most successful species in the galaxy, having spread to countless worlds and persisted through every catastrophe. From a certain perspective, the Old Ones succeeded magnificently in creating a warrior race that would survive anything the galaxy could throw at it. That those warriors became simple-minded brutes rather than sophisticated soldiers might be seen as an acceptable trade-off for their remarkable resilience. The Jokaero similarly persisted, largely unchanged from their original design. They continue to wander the galaxy in their strange lattice-frame ships, creating impossible devices and avoiding entanglements with other species. Their survival demonstrates the robustness of the Old Ones' final creations, engineered during the most desperate phase of the war when there was no time for refinement or testing. That beings created under such circumstances could persist for 60 million years speaks to fundamental design principles the Old Ones understood, even when working under extreme pressure. Other Old Ones creations survived in various forms, their exact relationships to their ancient progenitors often unclear or disputed. The Hrud maintain legends of beings called Ka, who may represent cultural memories of the Old Ones, passed down across millions of years until the specific details have been lost, but the general reverence remains. Various other species scattered across the galaxy carry genetic markers suggesting deliberate engineering. Though whether that engineering was performed by the Old Ones specifically, or by Aeldari or other successor civilizations, remains ambiguous. The Old Ones seeded so many worlds and influenced so many evolutionary paths that tracing their specific handiwork has become nearly impossible. The Webway itself stands as perhaps the Old Ones' most enduring legacy. Despite the catastrophic damage inflicted during the War in Heaven and subsequent millennia, large portions of the network remain functional. The Aeldari still use it as their primary means of interstellar travel. The Dark Eldar have built their city of Kamarog within the Webway, exploiting its dimensional peculiarities to create a sanctuary from Slaanesh's hunger. Even the Imperium, through the Emperor's attempts to create new Webway portals, acknowledges it as the single most strategically valuable asset in the entire galaxy. Countless other species and factions use isolated sections for various purposes, often without understanding what they truly navigate. The Webway's persistence demonstrates the Old One's engineering capabilities more clearly than any other artifact. For a structure to remain functional for 60 million years through the War in Heaven, the Enslaver Plague, the Age of Strife, and countless other catastrophes requires design principles and construction techniques that exceed anything modern civilizations can achieve. The Mechanicus has spent thousands of years studying what Webway sections they can access, and they remain fundamentally baffled by how it works. The materials used in its construction cannot be replicated. The dimensional engineering involved cannot be reproduced. The wards that protect it from demonic intrusion cannot be duplicated. It stands as a monument to capabilities the galaxy will likely never see again.
How the various races of the 41st millennium remember or understand the Old Ones varies considerably based on their own history and perspective. The Aeldari retain the clearest memories, though even their accounts are colored by millions of years of cultural evolution and the catastrophic trauma of the fall. Aeldari legends speak of the Old Ones with reverence, portraying them as wise teachers who guided their species from primitive origins to cosmic significance. Some Aeldari still refer to the Old Ones in mythological or religious contexts, though whether they literally worshipped them or simply greatly respected them remains debated among scholars. The Orcs have no conscious memory of their Krork origins or the Old Ones who created them. Their culture exists entirely in the present moment, focused on the immediate prospects for violence and plunder. Yet some Orc mechboys, when constructing particularly sophisticated devices, sometimes report feelings of instinctive knowledge, as if they are remembering something rather than inventing it. Whether these represent genetic memories from their Krork ancestors or simply the Orcs' natural technological aptitude remains unclear, but they hint at connections to a more sophisticated past buried deep in Orc biology. The Imperium's understanding of the Old Ones is fragmentary and often contradictory. Different sources within Imperial archives present different accounts of their nature and fate.
Some inquisitors who have delved into forbidden lore theorize about the Old One's influence on humanity's development, suggesting that Terra may have been one of the worlds they seeded with life.
Such speculation is considered extremely heretical by the ecclesiarchy, which maintains that humanity was created by the Emperor's divine will rather than through any Xenos engineering. Yet, the evidence that human psychers channel warp energy in ways suspiciously similar to Aeldari methodology raises questions that the Imperium prefers not to examine too closely. The Necrons remember the Old Ones with bitter hatred even after 60 million years. To the Necrons, the Old Ones represent the root cause of their current state. Had the Old Ones shared the secret of immortality, the Necron-Tire would never have been driven to such desperation that they accepted the C'tan's terrible bargain. The fact that the Old Ones may have been unable to grant immortality to another species, or that doing so might have posed dangers the Necrons could not comprehend, does not factor into Necron consideration. They blame the Old Ones for their transformation into soulless machines and resent them for it with a fury that has not diminished despite millions of years of hibernation. Some Necron lords have vowed to destroy any Old Ones' remnants they discover, seeking retroactive revenge against beings who may no longer exist in any meaningful sense. The greatest mystery surrounding the Old Ones concerns the question of survivors. Did any Old Ones actually survive the war in heaven and its aftermath? Various claims and sightings have been reported across galactic history, though none have been definitively verified. Some accounts speak of ancient reptilian beings encountered in deep Webway sections, traveling silently through the labyrinthine network before vanishing into sealed passages. Other reports describe worlds in the galactic periphery where impossibly advanced technology operates according to principles that exceed even Dark Age of technology standards. Still other whispers speak of entities that appear to guide developing species from the shadows, nudging their evolution in specific directions for reasons known only to themselves. The Rood presents one of the more intriguing cases for possible Old One survival or influence. These mysterious Xenos possess technology that can manipulate entropy and age materials instantly, capabilities that seem to operate on principles completely foreign to standard physics. Their legends speak of Ka, who taught them their technology and guide their destiny from beyond death. Some xenobiologists theorize that the Rood may have been in direct contact with Old One survivors within relatively recent galactic history, perhaps as little as a few million years ago. The Rood's refusal to discuss their origins or provide details about Ka makes verification impossible. But the sophistication of their entropy field generators suggests knowledge derived from sources more advanced than any currently extant civilization. The S'lani, those degenerate descendants of the ancient Slan, represent the closest thing to confirmed Old One's legacy in the current age. They live north of the galactic pole in a cluster of prosperous worlds, maintaining a closed society that rarely interacts with other species. The S'lani retain advanced technology they no longer fully understand, living according to rituals and life stage transitions that may be corrupted remnants of original Slan programming. Whether any S'lani remember specifics about the Old Ones, or whether that knowledge has been lost across millions of years of de-evolution, remains unknown. The S'lani do not welcome visitors, and attempts to study them have typically ended poorly for the investigators. Perhaps the most tantalizing possibility concerns the Emperor of mankind himself. Some radical theorists within the Inquisition have quietly speculated about whether the Emperor might have some connection to the Old Ones. His age, spanning at least 40,000 years and possibly much longer, combined with his unparalleled understanding of psychic engineering and genetic manipulation, raises questions about his origins. His attempt to create a human webway beneath Terra suggests knowledge of dimensional mechanics that should have been lost when the Old Ones fell. His creation of the Primarchs through genetic engineering that incorporated warp-based elements mirrors Old One's methodology. Could the Emperor be an Old One survivor, hiding his true nature behind a human facade? Could he be a hybrid, perhaps the result of Old One's intervention in human evolution? Or is he simply a human who independently achieved understanding similar to the Old Ones through his own genius and accumulated experience? Such speculation is, of course, utterly heretical by imperial standards, and anyone who publicly voiced such theories would likely face immediate execution.
The official imperial doctrine is that the Emperor is a uniquely human figure, perhaps divine in nature, whose power stems from humanity itself rather than any Xenos source. Yet, in the darkest corners of inquisitorial archives, in texts locked behind seals that would take decades to properly breach, such questions linger. The parallels between the Emperor's works and the Old One's known capabilities are difficult to dismiss entirely, though they could equally be explained by convergent evolution of technique among beings of sufficient power and knowledge. The truth about Old One survivors, if indeed any exist, may never be known. They could be extinct, with the last of their kind dying millions of years ago in Webway sanctuaries that have since been lost or destroyed. They could be hiding, observing the galaxy from secret locations, and choosing not to intervene in events they no longer feel capable of influencing. They could be transformed beyond recognition, having transcended physical form entirely to exist in states that would be completely undetectable to material species. Or they could simply be a myth, a legend maintained by successor species who wish to believe their creators might return someday to restore the order and peace that characterized the galaxy before the war in heaven. What is certain is that the Old One's influence on the galaxy extends far beyond their physical survival. Every psychically active species in the current age exists on a foundation they built. Every journey through the Webway traverses infrastructure they constructed. Every encounter with chaos demons faces entities whose existence was enabled by choices the Old Ones made during their desperate war for survival. The Imperium of Man, the Aeldari craft worlds, the Orc empires, the Necron dynasties, all exist within a galactic environment fundamentally shaped by decisions made millions of years before any of their current leaders were born. The war in heaven serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of power and the unintended consequences of desperate action. The Old Ones possessed capabilities that made them effectively gods by modern standards. They could create life, engineer species, manipulate dimensions, and bend reality to their will. Yet for all their power, they could not prevent the corruption of the warp or the emergence of the enslavers. They could not save themselves from extinction despite having literally millions of years to prepare and adapt. Their very success, the psychically active species they created and nurtured, became the vector through which their doom manifested. There is something profoundly tragic about the Old Ones' fate. They were not conquerors seeking to dominate the galaxy. They were not monsters inflicting suffering for pleasure. By all accounts, they genuinely sought to nurture life and guide species toward their full potential. They spent millions of years carefully cultivating civilization across thousands of worlds. When forced into warfare, they fought defensively, creating warriors only when necessary to defend themselves against an implacable enemy. Yet, despite their relatively benevolent intentions, or perhaps because of them, they triggered changes that would condemn the galaxy to 60 million years of horror. Consider what the galaxy lost when the old ones fell. They possessed knowledge of psychic engineering that has never been equaled. Their understanding of dimensional mechanics allowed them to create the Webway, a feat the Emperor himself, one of the most powerful beings ever to exist, could not fully replicate. Their patience and wisdom allowed them to guide species across millions of years of development. Their technology exceeded anything that would come after, combining psychic power and material science in ways that modern civilizations cannot even comprehend, let alone reproduce. All of this was lost, scattered, or destroyed during the war in heaven and its aftermath. The galaxy that emerged from the Enslaver Plague was fundamentally poorer than what had existed before. Civilization had to begin again from scratch, with primitive species slowly developing the capability for spaceflight and rediscovering principles the old ones had perfected millions of years earlier. The warp, once a calm ocean suitable for navigation and exploration, had become a nightmare realm where demons lurked and sanity itself could be destroyed by momentary exposure. The knowledge of how to create new life, how to guide evolution, how to terraform worlds efficiently, all this understanding was gone. Subsequent species would stumble forward through trial and error, achieving in millennia what the old ones could have accomplished in years, and often failing entirely at tasks the ancient architects would have found routine. Yet, perhaps there is also a lesson in the Old One's story about the inevitability of change and the impossibility of permanent control. The Old Ones had shaped the galaxy for millions of years, creating a stable order according to their vision. But that order was static, maintained through their constant oversight and intervention. When they fell, the system they had built collapsed because it depended entirely on their continued existence and guidance. The galaxy that followed was more chaotic, certainly, and vastly more dangerous. But it was also more dynamic, with space for new species to rise and fall according to their own merits rather than old ones' design. The Imperium of Man exists in a galaxy still scarred by the war in heaven. Every world humanity claims was potentially terraformed by the old ones millions of years ago. Every human psyker draws upon a warp that was corrupted during that ancient conflict. Every journey through the warp risks encounters with entities that may trace their lineage back to the predators that consumed the Old One's civilization. Every archaeotech discovery could be technology derived from Old One's designs, passed through Aeldari hands during their empire's height, then lost during the Age of Strife, now being rediscovered by Mechanicum explorators who cannot fully comprehend what they have found. In the darkness of the 41st millennium, when the Imperium stands on the brink of collapse and demons pour from the Great Rift, it is worth remembering that the galaxy has faced extinction before. The war in heaven and the Enslaver Plague represented a catastrophe that nearly rendered the galaxy uninhabitable to sentient life. A calamity that consumed civilizations that had endured for millions of years. Yet life persisted. Species adapted. Civilization rebuilt itself, however imperfectly. The old ones fell, but their creations endured, carrying forward fragments of knowledge and capability that would eventually seed new civilizations. Perhaps this is the Old One's true legacy. not the specific technologies or species they created, but the demonstration that life itself is remarkably resilient. They filled the galaxy with psychically active species designed to survive and thrive in hostile environments. Those species carried forward, evolving and adapting across millions of years, until they filled the galaxy once again. The Aeldari built an empire that lasted millions of years. The orcs spread to practically every region of space. Humanity arose from primitive origins to claim a galaxy-spanning domain. All of this happened without the Old One's guidance, driven purely by the survival instincts and adaptive capabilities they had engineered into their creations.
As the Imperium struggles against enemies on all sides, as chaos threatens to consume reality itself, as Necrons awaken to reclaim the galaxy they believe they won millions of years ago, the shadow of the Old One stretches across all these conflicts. They were the first, and perhaps the greatest of galactic civilizations, beings who achieved understanding of reality that has never been matched. They created species that would shape the galaxy's destiny long after their creators had passed into legend. They built infrastructure that persists across 60 million years, and they demonstrated through their fall that even gods can die when they disturb forces they do not fully understand. In the end, the Old Ones remain a mystery wrapped in legend, known primarily through their works and their creations rather than direct evidence of their existence. They are the architects who designed the foundation upon which all subsequent galactic history has been built. They are the teachers who provided knowledge that would be passed down through countless generations until its origins were forgotten, but its effects remained. They are the gardeners who seeded worlds and guided evolution across millions of years, creating a diversity of life that would persist through every catastrophe the galaxy could produce. Whether they truly perished entirely, or whether fragments of their civilization persist in hidden corners of the galaxy, their influence cannot be escaped.
Every being that uses the warp, every traveler through the Webway, every species that fights for survival in a hostile universe exists within a context they created. The Old Ones shaped the galaxy more profoundly than any force before or since. And 60 million years after their fall, that shaping continues to determine the fate of all life among the stars. They are gone, yet they remain. They are forgotten, yet they are everywhere. They were the first, and in a very real sense, they may prove to be eternal.